Welcome to the panel. My name is Adriana Dergam. I represent CEDMO, which is the Central European Digital Media Observatory based in Prague, in the Czech Republic. And it is one of the 8 hubs focused on fighting disinformation, supported by the European Commission. We are part of the CEDMO network that was mentioned by several speakers throughout the morning. And I'm not here alone. Without any further ado, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished speakers, all 3 of them definitely an authority on the topic of defunding disinformation. So first, let me welcome Christina Stamp, who heads the Media, Convergence and Social Media Unit in DG Connect of the European Commission. The unit is in charge of the Commission policy on combating disinformation online. It's also responsible for social media policy, as well as research and innovation funding. We have heard a lot about the code of practice on disinformation. It was mentioned by several speakers during the summit, and it's Christina's unit that's behind the development of the code, and now they are working on the guidance on how to strengthen the code. So we'll definitely come back to this topic. Christina, welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Christina. And our second speaker represents the digital advertising ecosystem. We have the pleasure to have Townsend Feehan with us. She's the CEO of Interactive Advertising Bureau Europe. IAB Europe is the voice of digital businesses of the leading European industry association for the digital marketing and advertising. Townsend, great to have you in our breakout session. Welcome.
Very nice to be here, and really enjoyed the sessions this morning, and looking forward to our discussion now.
We'll continue also with our third speaker. It's a powerful woman representing an industry association of leading internet companies in Europe as Google, Apple, Facebook, or Amazon. And I'm very happy that Siada El-Ramli, the CEO of Digital Online Tech Europe, could make it to be with us today. Siada, welcome to our panel.
Adriana, thank you very much, and thanks for having me on this on the panel. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion this morning.
Thank you. So let's start with our first question about the code of practice on disinformation that was mentioned several times. My question would go first to Christina, and it's about how does the code contribute to defunding disinformation. But please, Christina, before you start answering, please could you clarify to our audience what the code is, what's its purpose?
With pleasure. So indeed, the Code of Practice on Disinformation is in place since 2018. The Commission has facilitated this self-regulatory Code of Practice in 2018 in view of the massive problems and threats that disinformation poses to our societies and democracies. And it is in place since 2018 with the participation of several major online platforms like Facebook, Google, Twitter, TikTok, Microsoft, Mozilla, and also the advertising industry is present. And in this panel, you have actually all the sites who are participating in the Code of Practice. So basically, the aim of the Code of Practice is to address the issue of disinformation through a complex toolbox. As said in the previous session, there is no one magic tool to basically eliminate disinformation, and taking content down is certainly not that magic bullet. That's why the Code of Practice is putting several tools basically out there that can contribute. And one of them is the monetization of disinformation, because I think it's quite logical if, so to say, the funding is cut off of the persistent perpetrators of disinformation, this can really make a change. And that's why when we have assessed the Code of Practice 1 year after its operation, last year we have also looked very particularly in this area. And indeed, when we published the guidance this year in May, where we set out on the Commission side how we expect the Code of Practice to be strengthened, the monetization is one of the key areas where we expect changes. And the signatories are already working on the renewed code that should be also strengthened in this area. I think it's important here to mention that when it comes to the advertising ecosystem, it's quite clear it's very complex. There are many players involved, from the brands, the advertiser who put their money there, and it's certainly not in their interest to fund disinformation, I would think. Then to everybody else who is participating through advertising placement, to the platforms. So what we say in the code of guidance to the code of practice is basically that all these ecosystem has to be involved in finding a solution in defunding disinformation. So a strong cooperation between these players is needed. I think there are ways to defund disinformation. There are tools available. But I think there are other players in this panel who can give you probably even more information about that part.
Thank you very much, Christina. And as IAB Europe and Dot Europe both are signatories, and Siada have been also involved in drafting that code, could you give us your thoughts about how can you strengthen the code, and what does it mean for your industry?
So obviously, as Christina rightly mentioned, initially it was left up to the platforms, and the commitments were targeted at the platforms and the advertising sector back in 2018. Those were the two industry sectors that were recommended to start putting something on the table. And that's why the Code of Practice was a global frontrunner as such, to have a systemic way of tackling disinformation. It was the first initiative on a self-regulatory basis that actually came off the ground, with the facilitation of the European Commission. Today, 3 years on, it's taken a completely different turning. We had the initial objective was to tackle disinformation in the context of political advertising for the European election. That moved on to the pandemic, obviously, and tackling disinformation around the pandemic. So it showed us how broad that problem really is, what tools we have at our disposal, and what we don't have either yet. So now we have the guidance from the European Commission as to what they would like to see in the code. We're using that as a step-for-step guidance as to what we need to take on board. But now we have to be able to translate it into commitments. And obviously, we already have an expanded code in terms of more stakeholders taking part in it. But we still are missing part of the ecosystem. So the news media sector is still not part of that. And they still are a profit-making sector that is not part of the discussions under the code today. One that we could potentially envisage eventually taking part. And I don't think that a response we see in a slightly separate context in the Digital Services Act, for example, a request for editorial content to be exempt from takedown. Now, that in itself is going to be a major impediment to the work that we're doing here in disinformation, and one that I think in terms of defunding as well, we need to take into account. But maybe I shouldn't overstep my time either, and I'll hand it over to, I don't know if Tanya would like to add anything.
Definitely, I think Townsend, also you have the view of your advertising and marketing industry to the code and the new version of the code.
Yeah, maybe just to echo what Siada said, and a little bit of what Christina said. So obviously, trying to represent the whole advertising ecosystem, we are an industry that is, significantly in the spotlight right now. A lot of challenges, privacy and data protection, challenges with enforcement of privacy and data protection law that reflect poorly on the industry, no matter how hard we try to comply with the law. And so the last thing we need is to be seen as an agent or motor of the creation and diffusion of online disinformation. So similar to Siada's organization, we participated in the drafting, contributed to the drafting of the code in 2017, 2018. And are working on the revision following, as Siada said, the guidelines laid down in this May guidance from the Commission. I think there are calls a couple of times a week, and looking to this as an important sort of next step or contributor to getting the industry into a better place in terms of image and reputation. And supportive of all the transparency, transparency, a huge amount of transparency already laid down in privacy and data protection law. Some additional transparency requirements coming along in DSA, and absolutely in favor of maximum amount of information disclosures and the whole paradigm of information and choice that's been at the core of Europe's regulatory approach to users and data-driven advertising, but which is a little bit in peril now for different reasons, mostly in the privacy and data protection debate.
It's very interesting, but Townsend, I would also ask you something that Siada mentioned. I mean, do you think who is missing at this table of reviewing the code? Is there some stakeholder that should be included and it's not, from your point of view?
So I think Siada's point about the media is interesting. I thought it was interesting. Rasmus's research was fascinating. Hadn't seen that before. I don't know if it was debuting today or if it's been previously published. But it was interesting to see that the people's perceptions of the agents and sources of online disinformation seem to be politicians, platforms, and then thirdly, and to a degree, publishers. And so I would agree that while our media membership, I would say, because we have a lot of publishers, would fit into the category of quality media that are victims of online disinformation as a phenomenon. I think the approach taken pursuant to which the media were sort of on the other side or somehow excluded or cordoned off is probably could be rethought for this next phase, but to have their positive input more than necessarily to put them in the camp of the culpable.
Understood. Christina, would you like to react to that? I think, Christina, we can't hear you. Well, meanwhile, yes.
Yes, sorry, I have a connection issue this morning. But I wanted to stress from our side as the facilitator of the European Commission behind the code that we definitely welcome everybody around the table that wants to join the fight against disinformation. This is also a key point of the guidance that we have published. I think it was a very good approach to start this in 2018 with some key players, but now it's the time to enlarge the circle. And we are very happy that we could already announce on Friday that several new signatories are joining the code, but it's not yet too late to join. And we would particularly invite also players from the advertising sector to join in order to make the response stronger in the area of the monetization. But also we welcome also smaller platforms, specializing platforms, because as also discussed in the other discussion, the solution cannot be that disinformation or funding of disinformation moves from some platforms to the others. So just to make an advertisement from our point of view, that the call that we published together with the signatories is still open. And I think in order to have a stronger code that has also a stronger response on defunding disinformation, we can very much use new players to join.
Thank you, Christina, for this invitation to other new stakeholders. I think I hope it will be used. Yes, Townsend.
And just to sort of complete the thought, I think also advertiser engagement, right? So the potential of choices made by advertisers to influence the behavior of the whole rest of the ecosystem can't be underestimated.
Definitely. I would just remind also the audience, please, if you have questions, if you want to react, comment, use the Q&A function, and we will go back to your questions by the end of the session. So please interact, don't be shy, be social. Well, let's then go from the code Yeah, sorry, from the code of practice to the industries. And my question would be, I mean, what is the industry talking about marketing, advertising, but also big internet players as Google, Facebook, etc., doing to demonetize misinformation? And also, do you measure what you do? I mean, what's the impact of the measures you have put in practice? Because that's very often the problem of measurements of the measure. So, Siada, maybe you could share with us your practice.
Sure, there has been a lot of measurement, Adriana, that has already taken place. But I think it's common knowledge to anybody who has also followed the progress on the code that there are still questions from researchers whether the data that has been provided is, to use one of Christina's phrases, fit for purpose as such, and what needs to be added to that. So, and that's exactly what we're revisiting now. Now, it is quite a daunting task to come up with a set of KPIs that would be necessary to measure the quality of the data across such a broad range of signatories, in terms of services, in terms of tools that they use, in terms of means as well that they have at their disposal to actually, in this context, to defund disinformation. Because we need to keep a level of a horizontal nature as such in terms of setting the KPIs, but at the same time be able to be specific enough that it's worthwhile and that it's something that can be seen as actual evidence that can be used, especially by those who are trying to do something with the data, be it from an evaluation perspective or be it from a research perspective on disinformation and trends therein. So there has been a lot of reporting done, especially in the context of the pandemic in 2020. There, the reports were going out from the companies once a month at a certain point in time, but there are still gaps that have been recognized by the European Commission, by ERGA, by some of the researchers. And those gaps in terms of research, we are definitely going to endeavor to address them all. What will have to be seen is whether all of the concerns can be addressed. The other concern that you mentioned slightly, Adriana, in your presentation of the question was, can we have a uniform way in tackling the defunding? And it's probably a no, just because of the differences in the services and in terms of what they can actually take in terms of measures. In the previous session, there was some critique on whether takedown is enough or if there should be, for example, context taken into account in tackling disinformation. Also, in terms of defunding, how far down the stack can we go to be able to tackle disinformation, because you're talking about so many different parties that have to communicate. So where will that responsibility lie? And that is exactly what we're looking at right now on how to create those common lines. I hope that was of help.
Yes, thank you very much. Townsend, from your industry, can you share some specific examples of measures that you have introduced to tackle disinformation and the evaluation of those measures, how successful they were?
Sure. Maybe it's useful first to clarify sort of the two scenarios that we consider to be our piece or our part of the puzzle here as IAB Europe. And those scenarios are, first, digital advertising funding, inadvertently, hopefully, funding media and other sites that create and diffuse online disinformation, and that could include sites that are created by state actors to manipulate public opinion. And then digital advertising that may itself constitute disinformation. So for the first scenario, we have things like brand safety tools that can work to detect the context and other information about the environment in which an ad is intended to appear and make an assessment of whether or not that environment is appropriate. The implementation of know your customer policies, so good discipline about the buyer knowing who the seller is, the seller knowing who the buyer is. Private marketplaces and direct buys that ensure that buyers work only with trusted publishers and vice versa. And with the understanding that limits, there's a trade-off there in terms of scale and reach of advertising campaigns, and implementation of blacklists based on fact-checking by well, fact checkers or other reputable third-party sources. And my impression is that for the for the actors outside of the platforms, the fact-checking dimension and the ability to leverage blacklists hasn't quite kicked in the way that perhaps three years ago one thought in the abstract it might. And that seems perhaps an important thing to work on in the next phase.
Thank you very much. Anyone to add to this from the panel? We are receiving quite a lot of questions, so I will ask the last one, which is mine, and then we will go to the question because they are very interesting and very diverse. So, as I promised, the audience is the king. So we'll come back immediately to you. My last question, and I think it already was mentioned during the morning, was the case when the disinformation is being spread by politicians or influencers, and they amplified via also like traditional media outlets that simply are reporting, or those but in a certain way supporting misinformation. I mean, how do you see this problem, and how do you see from the different points of view of your industry or European Commission this should be addressed? Christina, please, could you start?
Certainly, it is a very topical issue. I think, again, we are back to what is basically taking content down as one tool and what are the other tools available. I think in this context, again, not to go into specific examples, but I think it's one issue is whether this type of content, for example, it is appropriate or not to take it down. I think from the freedom of expression perspective, we can all understand that this solution may not be the right one, in particular when it comes to politicians. However, there are other tools available. There are fact-checking available that can be, for example, used in this context, and other tools, including the monetization of whether this type of content should be then also incentivized in one way or another. So I think that there are tools out there apart from the, so to say, the nuclear weapon that probably is not always very wise to use, that can have a contribution to solve this issue.
Thank you. Siada, what are your thoughts?
Well, so on the political advertising side, I think obviously we're also all waiting with impatience to see what the legislative proposal will actually come up with later this year at EU level. So there is the line of work that we're doing within the code, but that's going to be much more prescriptive to the areas that have been identified as well through the evaluation of the code so far, be it by the Commission, by the guidance, or by ERGA in their reports so far. Whereas the legislative proposal will actually set up a framework as well as creating more definition, hopefully, in terms of what is possible in the political context. And I think we desperately need that. That is an area that we asked for more guidance from the European Commission back in 2018, even on electoral processes, for example, what that actually means, when things can be placed, what the limitations have to be in terms of advertising, because we don't have that definition at EU level. So we're waiting for that as can I be as bold as to say as a backbone to what we're doing on the code? But we definitely need to have that guidance as well. So I think we at least will have a clearer direction of travel.
Thank you very much. And Townsend, anything to add from your point of view of your industry, advertisers?
Yeah, so it's going to sound like an evasion on my part, but I think in the first instance, maybe that's not an advertising related problem, because you could have that scenario in a pure subscription, or media that are partially subscription funded and partly advertising funded, and it's, I mean, just incredibly tricky, because you could have lots of completely legitimate content, yeah, so I wouldn't presume to point the way forward for that, but it just gets to the heart of the complexity of the issue.
Thank you. Yeah, definitely. Let's go to the questions of our audience. And the first one, I think, is Christina, for you. We have received a lot of questions, so I have to stick to my promise. Adeline Brion, and I'm sorry for mispronouncing probably, is asking, The 2018 high-level expert group urged that the EU, that initiatives fighting disinformation should secure matching funds from civic, public, and private entities to secure Europe's credible fight against disinformation. What progress should be underway to create such a balanced fund?
Luca, I think we are looking back at the 2018 high-level expert group that indeed took a much broader approach than what can be and what should be done when it comes to fighting disinformation. I think one of the fruits that this has borne is the Code of Practice on Disinformation. I think another fruit that has been born is CEDMO and the recent hubs. Then the Commission is also funding media literacy related activities. And I think there are several approaches that are also combining funding through various sources. I think this is basically, again, a proof that there is no one magic book, but or one fund that I think can address all the issues. That I think all these players that have started to work together on these, and I mean also, I think it's important to mention ERGA as a player, as the national regulators. I think if you put all these responses together, then I think this can all contribute to a healthier more disinformation-free environment.
Thank you very much. There's also a question on funding in the Gulbenkian Fund, but I'm afraid that our speakers are not don't have the information and the background. So I'm sorry, Nicoletta, we can't answer your question, but I think you can redirect it to the right person from the fund. The other question that we've got, it's a double question, and I think it goes, Townsend, to you. Dominic Young is asking, to what extent is the problem, I think, of disinformation made worse by the dominance of advertising-based revenue models on the internet? Do users trust sources they are paying for more than those they don't? And he adds, and I leave it up on you, I mean, which part of the question you answer, obviously. To flip my question, should we talk about how we fund good information? Does the current polarization of monetization models make the problem worse? Please, Townsend, a short answer, if you can.
A short answer. So I think we have to. I think it's only fair to acknowledge that the ad-funded business model incentivizes time spent on a site, on a page, and that may have a relationship, may incentivize certain types of content that have pernicious or consequences for society. I think you need to balance that against the problem of inequality of access to quality information. I don't think that's exactly the way he said it, that Rasmus evoked this morning, information inequality. So the fact of quality information being available according to an ad-supported model that enables users to decide which things they subscribe to or pay for online and which things they pay for with a willingness to receive advertising with all the transparency and control that the law provides for. I think that's something we don't want to throw out either. So it seems to me that the answer is managing the downsides. Yes, that wasn't so short.
Thank you, Townsend. Siada, you would like to add something, please do.
Very, very briefly, just the wording good information or good, that in itself is so subjective. And I think that lies at the core of what we're actually talking about. What does good information mean? So especially throughout the pandemic, we've seen that we at least had a good starting point on promoting authoritative sources. That's where we had to go to the lead authorities, the World Health Organization, but there were clear identifiers as to who we could refer to. We were going to the Ministry of Health, we were going to the World Health Organization. But in many cases, we don't have that luxury. And that's where the fact checkers come in. That's where it's so important to have this broader community of players interacting with one another, because we definitely, as an industry, as internet players, do not want to be the ones judging on what is good information or not. That is not our role to play. And we do see that there's a fundamental right for freedom of expression. And let's keep knowledge and information out there online, and people need to be able to make those decisions. So what Tani said, flag when it's promoted, flag when there's advertising. Let's have transparency in place, but we can't decide what is possible.
Thank you very much. We are coming to the end. So thanks to all our speakers, Siada, Christina, Townsend, for bringing your views and expertise. Thank you all. Stay well and safe.